I warmly welcome you to this beautiful place. Welcome to those participants online from around the world. It is wonderful that we are all here. It is very exciting. What a beautiful day to hold this gathering. Thank you all for leaving all you are supposed to be doing at this moment to attend this important gathering. I am Sister Eukaria Madueke, a sister of Notre Dame de Namio, and I coordinate the Women Empowerment Project of Africa Faith and Justice Network. For some of us who do not know this organization, AFJN, Africa Faith and Justice Network, is the only faith-based NGO, Pan-African in Washington, DC. It's a community of advocates for responsible US relationship with Africa. While we educate and advocate for just Africa-US relationship in Washington here, we also serve as a voice to inform and motivate our brothers and sisters in Africa to be agents of their own destiny. Thanks to the US missionary congregations that started this organization 43 years ago. Today, we come together to explore how to navigate the future of US-African relations, opportunities and challenges in a shifting landscape. Again, it is my joy to welcome you all to this gathering. Welcome on board. We can't wait to start this adventure together. I welcome Dr. Stephen Rogers, the Executive Director for Africa Faith and Justice Network. Dr. Steve will be introducing our guest speakers and also moderating the event of today. Dr. Steve, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sister Eukaria, and thank you for the work that you do, and for all our colleagues, our community, for what we have done for 43 years, trying to focus on strategic things that improve the relationship between the US and Africa. Without much ado, to our online audience and to those who are already here, I'm going to start straight to introduce our guests. First, what I'm going to do is to introduce our keynote speaker who will come and speak, and then I'll introduce our two esteemed panelists, and then after that, we'll have a really lively debate. Let me introduce Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool. He's the ambassador for the Republic of South Africa to the United States. Ambassador Rasool has recently been appointed by South Africa for a second tour of duty as ambassador to the US. His first was between 2010 and 2015. Both followed distinguished contributions to public life in South Africa. Firstly, as an activist and leader in the anti-apartheid liberation struggle, making sacrifices, like spending time in prison where he first met Nelson Mandela. Secondly, as a leader of both the African National Congress and in the faith movements, Muslim and interfaith. And thirdly, in the first generation of post-apartheid governance as Provincial Minister of Health, Finance, and ultimately Premier of Governor of Western Cape Province. In between his diplomatic postings, Ambassador Rasool was a distinguished scholar at Georgetown University, publishing a book titled Living Where We Don't Make Rules, a guide for Muslim minorities. And he remains a senior fellow at both Georgetown and Rutgers universities, a recipient of honorary doctorates at Roosevelt and Chatham universities, and has been bestowed an adjunct professorship at the Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. He remained active in pursuing development in South Africa and Africa as an associate in Albright Stonebridge, later Denton's, through his own business advisory entity. Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool and Associates, and as chairperson of the Development Bank of South Africa. Through his leadership of the World for All Foundation, he leads public discourses, he conducts leadership masterclasses, and he publishes widely in pursuit of his vision to, quote, to create a just, dignified, and sustainable world for all, free of extremisms and safe for difference. It is so much of our honor to welcome His Excellency, the Ambassador of the Republic of South Africa, who will give a keynote speech, and then we will invite our keynote speakers. Welcome, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Stephen Rogers. Thank you very much for that warm welcome. And I must speak to my office about trimming down on the biography because it reminds me of a mother who took the child to the funeral of the father who had passed away. And they went to the church, sat in the front row, and they were singing the hymns, saying the prayers, reading the scriptures, and then they came to the part where they were going to now give testimony to the life of the deceased. And someone from work got up, said, what a hard worker. Someone from the sport said, what a great sportsman. Someone from the church said, what a great churchgoer, and so forth and so forth. And halfway through, the mother took the child by the hand and said, come, my child, this is not your father's funeral.
That's it.
But I raised the idea of a funeral. Not because we think that there's a funeral, but there's something funereal about what has descended over Washington. I saw Washington in 2010, as you mentioned, in the great optimism, the great faith of the Obama era. And I've been asked by the President of South Africa to return here to use my 7-year knowledge of Washington to see whether there is a navigation to be made through what has descended on Washington, the US, and now it's clear also the world in the wake of the Trump presidency. And so you can feel the difference. You can walk into Congress and see how guarded members of Congress are about what they say and what they commit to. You can meet non-profit organizations and business associations, and you can pick up. There's a caution that didn't exist before there was optimism. You can speak to activists, and you can get the sense that they are bewildered. 10 years ago, activists had a sense of mission. They were purposeful. Now they are bewildered, wondering what went down. And you can speak to the political commentariat, and they use excessive words such as authoritarian, dictator, all of those kind of things. And so this is an atmosphere to which I've returned, and this is the atmosphere in which I have to navigate my country's interests in the United States and Africa's future with the United States. Now, it's very important that the African Faith and Justice Network uses two nouns in there that may look very contradictory, faith and justice. But you see, in South Africa, we learned that the pursuit of justice is a never-ending one. But what keeps you on the road for justice is faith. The belief in what you have not yet seen. Even those South Africans who were waiting to be hung by the apartheid government, they would use the slogan, freedom in our lifetime, even as they were marched to the gallows to be hung. Because what they had was faith. The ability to believe in that which you have not yet seen, but understanding that the path to it is by itself an act of liberation, that you have not succumbed. So this idea of faith and justice being juxtaposed is a very crucial one, especially in times when pessimism comes more naturally than optimism, where despair comes more naturally than faith. And so we need to understand what we are to do. But we need to operate with two sides of the binary. The one side is that what keeps us going would be our values. What do we believe in? What is so dear to us that we are willing to sacrifice for it? Those values. On the other side, we need to understand, how do we pursue our interests? What do our societies need? What does our nation need? What does our continent need to survive and to thrive? And you know, foreign policy is very much like a telescope. It has two lenses. The one is your lens of values, the other one is your lens of interest. And a country decides which lens it puts against its eye. So, and it was controversial then, we've healed it since then, but when Nelson Mandela, for example, opposed Sani Abacha for executing Ken Saro-Wiwa, he firmly put his values against his eye and then calibrated his interests. He said the value of justice is more important than a trade relation with Nigeria. So he looked at his interests through the lens of his values. Now you can imagine what happens when the opposite takes place. When you turn the telescope around and you first see your interests, and then you say, I'll shift my values. I'll change my values. I'll recalibrate my values. Now, this sounds like a really philosophical introduction to a speech that speaks about navigating the future of US-South Africa, the relations, opportunities, and challenges in a shifting landscape. But I believe that we will not understand what we are busy with if we don't understand that interplay of values and interest, because it gives us a tool to make sense of what we are seeing. Otherwise, we are just angry people. I've met angry Democrats. I've even met angry mainstream Republicans. I've met angry journalists. I've met angry activists. They are bewildered, and in their bewilderment, they are upset, they are angry, they are outraged by what they are seeing, when they see aid being slashed, when they see people being deported, when they see the borders being closed, all of those kind of things. They are angry. In Africa, we have a saying, Your anger is hot, but it cannot cook. Your anger is hot, but it cannot cook. And our task is to make your anger cook. Not to indulge your anger. Not to wildly express your anger. Because all of that doesn't cook. And therefore, the kind of topic that the Africa Faith and Justice Network is putting to us is, if I can put it differently, how do you make your anger cook? How do you transform your bewilderment into clarity? How do you take your confusion and give it direction and clarify it? How do you take your fears and seek within it opportunity? How do you take the challenges and work out how you can meet those challenges? And that really is the principal task in front of us. Now, there's a four-footed shift in the landscape and the relationship between the United States today, 2025, and Africa. The first shift has been very well publicized. It's the cutting of development aid and assistance. But again, we as Africa are part of a global cut that has happened. The closing of USAID, the closure of PEPFAR, the HIV funds that the US has, that's African. Specifically African, the closure of PEPFAR, and so forth. USAID touches educational programs, particularly in Africa, health interventions, the cutting of funding from the WHO, the World Health Organization, stops so many programs, fighting malaria here, fighting this there, fighting that there. That's the implications for Africa. So the first leg on which the shifting landscape stands is on the cut in development aid and development funding. But the second one is the cut in multilateral funding. Anything to do with climate, anything to do with just transition, anything to do with mitigating climate change has been subjected to cut. South Africa, for example, last Friday learned that the Just Energy Transition Partnership has been cut in the midst of an energy shortage in South Africa. The idea of not bringing the renewable energy to the grid will create enormous social hardships for our people, as well as enormous economic hardships for our industries. So that's the second leg on which it stands. The third leg on which it stands is the leg of trade. We have seen the idea, the memorandum that the White House has put out on fair and reciprocal trade and tariffs. We've seen that friends are not safe, like Canada. Neighbors are not safe, like Mexico. And even foes are not safe, like China. Now, what's still about us in Africa? If this is what is happening with big trading partners. And so Africa needs to begin to wonder on the timeline that is in front of us, what will happen on the 2nd of April if the Trump administration puts forward its plan for universal tariffs. And then moving towards September with the date for whether AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunities Act, will be reauthorized. So we have a horizon of about a year in which we need to manage what we do. We didn't have that kind of runway for development aid, for multilateral funding. Here we have a runway that is either 2 weeks away or 7 months away. So this is the pressure under which we are operating. And of course, the fourth leg on which this landscape is shifting is what I call the geopolitical leg. And South Africa has been particularly under the spotlight, to put it mildly, in the crosshairs, to put it a little bit more aggressively. Because particularly of South Africa's charging Israel with genocide at the International Court of Justice. That's a fairly major geopolitical focus on South Africa. Secondly, South Africa's membership of BRICS, its association with China, and thirdly, South Africa's non-alignment in the Russia-Ukraine situation. And so we can list what are some of these flashpoints that in the relationship, particularly between South Africa and Africa. There is a suggestion that South Africa sending troops on behalf of SADC to protect Eastern DRC may be seen in geopolitical terms as a threat to African partners of the White House. So we're sitting here with this four-pillared shifting landscape that we need to manage as we go forward. Some are very specific, like some of the geopolitical issues with South Africa, but some are generic because the administration seems to have an equal opportunity approach to everyone. Everyone will, some call it the Oprah effect. Everyone gets it. Like tariffs and so forth. I think some premises of these four are on faulty premises. Just when South Africa thought, for example, that it was on the wrong side of the Russia-Ukraine situation, we found that President Trump went even further than our non-alignment. He moved from President Biden's position of alignment, full alignment with Ukraine. We stood in the middle and we were being punished for that. President Trump has gone to the other side. So even those who didn't want us to be in the middle are now coming to South Africa and saying, listen, can you invite Zelensky and see whether if he goes to the negotiating table that he gets a better deal out of this. So the premises are shifting all the time. For example, the premise on China. South Africa issued Taiwan with an order that it must move its liaison office out of the diplomatic area because, and yet we've been coexisting with them for 30 years. And as we said to some of the senators, the reason that this is happening now is because the United States is threatening to shoot us in the knees. But it first wants us to throw away our crutches. Because that's the effect of having to be angry, to have anger at you from the United States, and then you still have to court making China angry at you. That's going to be not just a South African case. This is going to be an African case. This is going to be a global South case. It's the law of unintended consequences. That which you want to prevent, you are actually accelerating. Because if we have to put our minerals through all of the tariffs that the US want, we may choose to sell it to a place where there are no tariffs. And China may be that place. So, you see, the law of unintended consequences is part of that faulty premise that exists within the thinking of this administration. I think another law of unintended consequences, and I make a joke with some of my friends, I say, I have two children. My eldest one, the daughter, is a theoretical learner. You can tell her, you know, this isn't right, that's what you must do, and she will imbibe it, absorb it, and then act on it. My son is an experiential learner. You can tell him the stove is hot. The problem is he may want to test it. Now, who do we have today in leadership? The theoretical learner that has studied some economics and where you say inflation follows tariffs. Or do you have an experiential learner who imposes tariffs and then puts her hand on the hot stove and says, yeah, no, it's actually causing inflation. There's no eggs here. The price of gas is going up, everything like that. Can I call Trudeau again and say, listen, I give you another month, and can I? You see, the unpredictability, and that's what is going to harm us more than the actual measures. You can't decide in September whether AGOA is going to be reauthorized because the industries that must feed AGOA must decide how much materials do they buy. And should they rather save the money in case there's no more AGOA after that? They must be able to tell Safeway, your oranges will come in October. But Safeway will say, are you sure? And they can't be sure. So Safeway will say, let me rather go and buy it from Chile. You see, that's the law of unintended consequences. That's the effect of experiential learning, as opposed to theoretical learning or learning by previous example. And so the unpredictability makes it seem pernicious, punitive. That it's as if someone has chosen a number today, yeah, 25%. No, 10% is not enough for China, 20%. You see, it's the unpredictability of policy that I think is going to be very harmful, because you can't plan with unpredictability. And then you have variability. And variability means Canada, Mexico, China, tariffs today. Oh, no, I give you another month. Okay, definitely. There's no room for negotiation. No, sorry, there's another month. So you see, what you're dealing with is shifting sands all the time. And the world can't plan based on the shifting sands. And so what we need to also understand, part of the law of unintended consequences is also what has taken the United States into 30 years of uninterrupted conflict, wars that it was thrown into, because the line between development and security is a straight line. It's not a zigzag line. It's a straight line. So you choose, how does 10% tariffs on a country equate to 20% increase in the budget for your military? That's the lesson from the hotspots of the world. You choose where you spend your money. In Afghanistan, you can choose to spend your money on development, or you'll spend your money on deploying your army. The Middle East, you can spend your money on development and democracy, or you can spend your money on fighting insurgents and terrorists and extremists. So you see, this law of unintended consequences, it's a fact that we are dealing with. So the final points of what I want to make is, what propositions can we put forward? I think the first proposition is a lesson that Europe has learned, that with all this unpredictability and variability and capriciousness and so forth, the United States is, at least for the next 4 years, not a reliable partner. And therefore, Europe has to increase its own budgets for its own security. That's not a bad thing. I think they rode their luck for quite a while. I think what makes it urgent is the fact of whether the White House sees the world as spheres of influence that we'll take, as the United States, will take the western half of the world. Russia can take Europe, and China can take Eurasia. Now that's threatening to Europe, but the lesson out of that is that, and some African presidents have started articulating it, how do we ourselves now ramp up our self-sufficiency? The problem is, we're going to deepen the problem, because if our self-sufficiency depends on trading east and no longer west, then I think we're going to remain a source of raw materials and commodities to the world, rather than the upgrading of our development level to manufactured goods that we can trade with the West. So I think that those are the kind of trade-offs. That's why it's not easy to say, let's just put all our eggs into the China basket. Because the China basket is a commodity basket, whereas for South Africa at least, the US basket has been a beneficiated basket. We send 70% of what we export to the US is manufactured. 80% of what we export to China is raw commodities. That's the trade-off we are going to have to. How are you? So I think what we are working through in these propositions is that we've got to shift our language from the solidarity-based language of my first time here to a transactional language. Not that we didn't get business done. We got good business done, but using a solidarity that would have existed between us. I think the solidarity has eroded, and now we need to get into the language of transactionality. So we can't deny it. I think South Africa was already showing an example of, take the PEPFAR funds. As Dr. Stevens have said, I was an MEC for health when we started dealing early on with the HIV/AIDS pandemic. And at that point, when we started, the South African government input into it was close to zero. And PEPFAR came in at 100%. Now that it is cut, and we do the math, South Africa's, the government's input into the fight is now 83%, and PEPFAR only constitutes 17%. For example, we buy all our own ARVs. The difficulty is that there are 200 NGOs funded by that 17% that disperse it. And that's where the interaction comes. And the consequences for a re-emergence of the pandemic across Africa is enormous. But I think that that curve between government input and US aid is probably the model. What we need to negotiate is for the ideal. For example, in AGOA, that AGOA is working, it's good, it's great for the development, it should be retained. As they say, plan for peace, but prepare for war. So we must go and push for peace, that AGOA must be retained, and we must put all efforts into it, but in our back pocket, have a transitional model in mind. 5 years, 6 years, not the 16 years that we had hoped for. But as and negotiate for AGOA being phased out rather than the guillotine, it's just been cut like PEPFAR was cut and like USAID and WHO was cut. Negotiate for a long runway and then begin using specific sectors or specific products to be able to say, these ones keep it immune from tariffs because they're critical for this, that, and the other. But these ones, let's incrementally become reciprocal in it. That's the language of transactionality that I think we're beginning to think through, just to be prepared, rather than be caught unawares as these things begin to happen. I think we also now need to guard more jealously our natural resources in Africa. We've seen the transactionality with Zelensky and his rare earth metals. We've seen it explode when he didn't sign the deal in the White House. It wasn't a temper necessarily. It was that at the last moment he decided not to pre-sign it, but to sign it after the discussion. And that's what brought the heat. So, and that's why guarding the DRC for Africa is so crucial. Because for as long as instability is there, there are critical minerals that reach the world through the black market and not through the open market. There is an investment in instability. And so the point that we must understand is that we can't, for every mineral, have the robber barons come in and take the first generations of gold out, like they did in South Africa. Then the generations of blood diamonds going out. And now the generations of critical minerals going out before Africa gets control over its mineral resources. I think we've got to be able to speak with one voice about, and the invitation, if we are talking the language of transactionality, the invitation is come and beneficiate our critical minerals in Africa. And if you need help, we will go to the African Development Bank. We will help with the Development Bank of Southern Africa to match funds, to de-risk, all of those kind of things. But we will make it comfortable for you to beneficiate in Africa raise our skills levels, raise our development trajectory, and then we negotiate offtake agreements with you. If we don't have that kind of approach to our resources, I think we will lose both on solidarity and transactionality. And I think for us to protect our minerals, we understood that, for example, we must build institutional depth in Africa.
Yes.
If we don't have that institutional depth, one, Africa can easily be divided, and B, Africa can easily be pillaged. It was the Kimberley process that created an institution with a set of rules, a set of values, and a transactional template that overturned the blood diamond scenarios. What are the equivalents with critical minerals and the other resources of Africa? And so protecting our resources requires institutional depth, and it requires economic diversification. Not only diversifying our markets, but diversifying our products as well. That we've got to have finished products in Africa with which to trade with the world. And most importantly, the precondition for trading and doing business with the world is trading and doing business in Africa.
That's right.
We have to be able to make the African Continental Free Trade Agreement work,
Yes.
because our value chains are integrated. A BMW that arrives in the USA with a made in South Africa stamp has rubber from the DRC, has leather from Botswana, has alloys from Zambia, has other components from another country, has this from there, has this from there. So what we do, we assemble what Africa offers.
That's right.
Together with the best of what the US offers, like in gearboxes and stuff like that. But if we don't have the African Continental Free Trade Agreement as the foundation of intra-African trade, we will all be sitting with the alloys only, and then we send that out. With the rubber only, and we export that. With the leather only, and we export that. The best chance of using our integrated value chain is to make great African products. I think that if we don't wake up and use this moment to really reimagine ourselves, we will only be pleading on a White House door that will remain shut. That's right. The White House does not respect weakness. It respects power.
That's right.
The White House does not respect vulnerability. It respects strength. And this is the moment for Africa to show its strength. Not a middle finger. Not a middle finger, because you never poke a bear when you have no defense. But you, as I said at the beginning, the middle finger is the sign of the angry. And as we said in Africa, we say, your anger is hot, but it cannot cook. Our anger must cook. And that's what I think this moment in our relationship with the USA tells us to do. Cook with your anger. Thank you very much.
Very well. Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you. We couldn't have started on a better note. Thank you so much. And I learned a lot. And apparently one of the things I'm going to get away from here today is that my anger it's hot, but it doesn't cook. Until my anger cooks, it means nothing. No matter how we're angry, we have to be strong. Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much. And I think there's a lot of a lot of interest in some of the things that you said, and people really want to, come back and maybe ask a few questions. But thank you so much. We hope you'll be gracious enough to stay a little bit as we welcome some of our guests as well. Just invite our two esteemed panelists. So with that in mind, without much ado, I know, please hold on to your questions if you're online, and for those of you who are here in the audience. And I want to introduce our two other very esteemed panelists who are going to add to what our distinguished keynote speaker has said, and so that we can have a real good conversation here. With that, I'm going to welcome our second speaker, Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith, whom I've known for as long as I've been at AFJN, and she's I call her the global Africanist because everywhere in Africa you go, she's been there. She is a senior associate strategist for the Pan-African and Orthodox faith engagement at Bread for the World in Washington, D.C. here. She brings extensive global, national, and local experience as a faith and public engagement thought leader. She's journalist, speaker, broadcaster, scholar, preacher, and author. In November 2023, she debuted her new book, Ahead of Our Time, Pan-African Women of Faith and Vision of Christianity, Mission and the Justice, published by the World Council of Churches. She's working on a new book now, A Legacy of Faith and Justice, Pan-African Advocacy and Leadership for Ending Hunger, that will debut in DC in June 2025. In September 2022, she was elected president of the World Council of Churches, WCC, from North America, Toru Island, at the WCC World Assembly in Karlsruhe, Germany. She is also the co-convener of the Pan-African Women and Faith Pan-African Faith Women's Ecumenical Power Empowerment Network. It's called PAWIN, and Africans and the Africans in the Diaspora Network, AAD. She's the former executive director and minister of the Church Council in Greater Indianapolis, Indiana, and Church Council in Trenton, New Jersey. She was also the first woman to serve as president of Historic Black Churches of Christian Churches Together, CCT, in the USA, and currently she serves in governance roles with the National Council of Churches. She's also a member of the Home Mission Board of the National Baptist Convention USA, Inc., President Clinton, Senator Richard Lugar, former Indiana Governor, Vice President of the USA, the Honorable Mike Pence, and two others of our alma mater, Yale University Divinity School and Kent State University, have all awarded her with high distinctions of leadership. Recently, she was awarded the Charlie Chisholm Award from the Conference of National Black Churches, CNBC, the Figel Award for Ecumenism by the Washington Theological Consortium in Washington, D.C., and Carlin House Award from Samuel DeWart's Proctor Conference and McCormick Theological Seminary. She's also a member of the inaugural class of History Makers, USA Smithsonian Museum, National Archive of Notable People of African Descent, and the founding delegate of the new United Nations Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. She received a doctorate degree from Princeton Theological Seminary, a Master's of Divinity from Yale University Divinity School, and a Bachelor of Arts degree from Kent State University. On June 7th, 2024, she received an honorary doctorate from the historic Wayland Baptist Theological Seminary, which began as a Baptist training union founded by free and escaped enslaved persons in 1812. She's a very good friend of AFJN, and we are always honored to have Reverend Dr. Angelique Smith to come and speak.
Good morning, all.
Good morning.
To His Excellency and the beautiful people of South Africa, where I've had the opportunity to live and sojourn, I greet you and salute you with my heart. To our wonderful leader of AFJN and to his team, including Bahati and all the rest of us here, and to all of you, the distinguished guests from Lesotho. Yes, I am a Lesotho woman. I live there also. And also our dear sister from Swaziland. I feel so at home to be here in this great Pan-African company to which we are a part of on this morning. I am honored to be with you. To my brother panelists who will come and say much more than I could ever say, I'm sure. I also say salute to you. I have good news for you. The ambassador has said so much. In fact, he has said it all in many respects. And I really want to celebrate and say, in my own way, hallelujah for his leadership, because I believe he has really named where we are in this moment, has named the challenges, but has also named the opportunity. And as you would appreciate as a woman of faith in the clergy, I love this conversation of faith and justice. I believe that is exactly where we are. We are now in a position of, as he has said, vulnerability, uncertainty. And what do we do when that moment comes? We have to step out on faith and figure it out. We have to walk in the darkness. You know, there's a man named David in the scriptures. I'm not going to preach, I promise you, although I am Baptist. So I err in that direction. But I'll pardon that for now. But just to say, David does teach us, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. And that's exactly what those policies are doing, creating moments of death and moments of profound fear. I have just come from the prayer vigil that Bread for the World has convened with DC Faith Coalition partners right over here at the Presbyterian Church on the Capitol. So I am basically in a very somber, sobering moment, having come from those prayers, saying that we know that the policies of literally cutting that 1% of the budget is costing major harms, injury, and yes, death. As we know, there are children, there are women, there are men who are affected by these resources that are rightfully theirs to be cared for in this moment. And so I just want to offer that up from the heart before I continue with my remarks. I don't know how much time I have, but I'll try to be fair because, again, the ambassador has really said so much. But what I want to do, because I am a woman of hope, and I believe we are too, otherwise we wouldn't be gathered here. And I even heard the ambassador speak of ways in which hope can yet be expressed even in the darkness. I want to propose some thoughts that we're thinking about at Bread for the World with our Public Research Institute as Senior Strategist for Pan-African and Orthodox Faith Engagement and Ecumenical Relations. I get to traverse in all of the life of Bread in many respects. And so in conversations with what we're doing in the Pan-African space, I want to offer at least about, I won't name them all, but some tools, a toolkit. I can't name them all, but the good news is aid is not the only tool in the toolkit. And of course, the ambassador has named some of those other things, and I'll bring my mind back to that in just a moment. But in the US toolkit, there are other opportunities. There are places within the larger framework of the United States where we want to encourage our African brothers and sisters to pursue with steadfastness. Now, these tools that I'm going to name come under 4 rubrics in which I am proposing that we engage this, quote, USA, America First priority, as it's been called, America First. And these priorities of security and prosperity, that's really what I think the policy is really trying to spell out. We want to secure the United States. We want to prosper the United States. At least that's the conversation, and that the cuts are somehow supposed to help us to get there. Bread for the World, as you know, really has a focus on food security and trade. And so my remarks will primarily come from that particular perspective. But these 4 areas, and of course the ambassadors named some of these things. But the first one would be policy and diplomacy. That would be one of the 4 areas. The second would be financing and investment. And of course, the ambassador made mention of that as well. The third one would be research and technical expertise. And then implementation, which transforms strategies into actionable programs like trade, which is what the ambassador was speaking of. Now, coming back to these tools and institutions, I want to first affirm what the ambassador already said around AGOA, but I also want to make sure we don't forget AWEB. So it's not only the Africa Growth Opportunity Act, happily, there is a women's side of the conversation. And I think it's important to say that the African Women's Entrepreneurial Program is related to AGOA. In other words, the policy understands that when women are empowered, yes. In fact, our hunger report at Bread for the World says when women are empowered, we can actually end hunger. We've actually done the studies at Bread for the World to show that. So that policy of both AGOA and AWEB as twins together is a very important tool that we need to encourage and to promote. Now, we know, as the ambassador has said, and by the way, I would just say Bread was there at the very beginning when that policy was adopted. In fact, we stood in the gap with World Vision when some others wanted to depart company and said, oh no, this is a faith issue. And literally the Congressional Black Caucus has actually recognized Bread in conversations I've had for the roles in which we stood in the gap as people of faith. And happily, we've been there ever since. However, we do know that the policy is in possible trouble, as the ambassador has said. It is up for reauthorizations. And I'm happy to say Bread is very much at that table, working with people like Fred Ojalande from the advisory group to say this policy not only must remain, but it must be expanded. We believe it needs to be expanded at least to 16 years. That's the proposals that we've been advocating for. We've been talking to congressional leaders to say, this works for everybody. Everybody wins with AGOA, AWEB. This is an America first priority, and it can also be a global priority. And happily, South Africa has been playing its role. And I believe we're in a moment now where it needs to play a bigger role. So we want to invite you to work with Bread and others to support AGOA, AWEB in this reauthorization period. Bread is committed to that. And I'm happy to say my president has been a part of those conversations. But what about what else may be in the toolkit? Well, some more good news. Guess who's hosting the G20 this year? Who? No. Yes. Yes. Look, I'm waving my flag. And I'm saying that's important. That will be an important global moment of a tool chest to say, we're hosting, and guess what? Not only does South Africa have an agenda to which the ambassador has spoken of, but Africa has a word to say as South Africa hosts that critical meeting. Now, I'm also happy to say, and I can say this too, as one of the presidents of World Council of Churches, we're meeting in South Africa too. In June 18th to 25th, and yours truly, Lord willing, inshallah, I will be there for that as well. And we are committed to much of what this agenda has been outlined from the ambassador today, just as Bread for the World would be. The ambassador has also mentioned the Africa Development Fund. That's also, I think, a very important tool that might be available. The U.S. Ag Department of State and International Culture, the Department of Commerce, the Millennial Development Fund, the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs, the Office of Agricultural Policy within the U.S. Department of State, the Millennial Challenge Corporation, the Global Food Security Research Strategy, Gender and Social Inclusion Practice Group within the Millennial Challenge Corporation, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, the Office of Economic and Development Affairs, also the MDB, or the Multilateral Development Bank. Yes, even Peace Corps in some of its emphasis on food security, the Research and Development Opportunity, the Office of Strategic Partnerships and Intergovernmental Affairs, the United States Agency for International Development, the United States Department of Agriculture, and yes, the World Food Program. Yes, these are some of the tools. I went a bit fast there, but I would encourage our African brothers and sisters to explore what these other institutions and tools might offer in a bilateral or a multilateral way, not only for aid, but also for partnerships and going back to the principles the ambassador outlined around trade. Of course, there's still the World Bank and the IMF and the other multilateral banks. And as I've already said, the G20 is a moment. But like the ambassador, I come to this as a concluding point because I know my time is not very long. It's not a Baptist time. In the end, it comes to strategy and it comes to framing, just like the EU has done in this moment, which has come together in a unified kind of way. That's what the EU has done. It's come together and said, yes, just like the ambassador said, yes, we're going to beef up our security. Oh, we're taking care of ourselves. Well, that's what I would say Africa has to do in this moment. There is, in fact, I don't see many other choices out there. I really don't. Now, I am not an ambassador. I am not president of a country. I am not any of those things. But from where I sit and the people I know and keep company with, that's where we are. There has to be not only an Africa strategy, but it has to be a Pan-African strategy. And those things go together, a united front. The ambassadors already mentioned the Continental Free Trade Agreement. I absolutely agree with that. And of course, that also means working with the African Union. You know, I tell my children and my godchildren, you know, it don't matter if y'all get along. Y'all still related. And y'all better show some love in front of me. Because that's who I am and that's who you are. Get over it. Whatever the challenges or quandaries have been, this is not a moment to go there. Find a way to go forward and be unified. And the Continental Free Trade Agreement and also working with the AU, I think is a wonderful way to do that. I will also add, I am very pleased that in the Pan-African space, that with the UN Permanent Forum of People of African Descent, we have another place where not only the nations gather, but people of the diaspora like myself and others. I've been there since the advocacy to bring the Permanent Forum together. I'm going to the 4th meeting in April. That's another place for the Africa group that's a part of the United Nations and also the AU to come alongside where we can come together with a larger Pan-African struggle and strategy as well. I am so pleased that there is now a formal memorandum of understanding between the Caribbean nations and the African Union. That was signed as a formal memorandum, and that is going forward. And it's around the issues of repair. It is around these historic issues that have kept us divided and also have robbed our economies that need to be reclaimed. Yes, unity, a unified front, and a resolution to do so that reinforces the Continental Free Trade Agreement, reinforces regional economies that come together in an integrated kind of way, not only on the continent, but with that 6th region of the African Union called the diaspora. This is a time for us to come together. Yes, reconsideration of these plans and a possible blueprint that can be formed in this moment, I believe is a way forward. I believe that tapping the bilateral and maybe multilateral engagements of those different institutions that I've mentioned, and there are others, I just gave a tip of the iceberg, is a way to think about partnerships that advance trade, advance prosperity on the continent, and I say also for the world. Africa is the world. Africa is the world. So when we speak of the Pan-African agenda, we're not only speaking of those like myself and others in this room, but for a global agenda of prosperity and hope. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, His Excellency, and thank you, our 2 speakers. And it's quite a lot of questions. Unfortunately, I know there won't be a lot of answers. So, you know, when because of the time, when we were planning on having this event, and this is the best way to start it is, we thought and we knew, and now I found out from the speeches that you have made that the landscape has shifted. Absolutely. And it has shifted dramatically. So this was not some kind of incremental change that you would see and you would plan for. So this is a very chaotic change. So and normally it kind of takes everybody off their guard in terms of planning. So here at the Africa Faith and Justice Network, even as we work on various policy issues, advocacies, we know where administrations stand and we know how we can engage them. Unfortunately, not the case this time. So that's why we are so looking forward to this kind of conversation. And I want to start with Mr. Ambassador because your country has taken a lead in terms of how the African continent responds. And I want to go straight to probably what you would call the big fish in the room, as you know, maybe in a lot of media. Perhaps I'll call this the diplomatic relationship between the US and South Africa has reached its lowest point since the transition to democracy in 1994. On February 7, the US President, Donald Trump, he just signed an executive order, which he titled Addressing Egregious Actions of the Republic of South Africa. The president has gone ahead, obviously offered citizenship to farmers, mostly white, if they want to come. And of course, I'm sure there's not much excitement about that from what I've had. My experience living in South Africa, you know, teaching there and hanging out with a lot of South Africans shows South Africans are, despite their divisions, like any other country, they are deeply patriotic people. I know that they love their country. Something often witnessed when we see the rugby, where everybody comes together, you know, regardless of how they feel. Now, what I want to know is, what does this relationship mean for your country? And perhaps more broadly for this conversation, what role can South Africa really play in promoting African interests and perspectives within this political dispensation?
No, thank you very much. The question gives room for a lot of rabbit holes to go down into, such as the Afrikaner issue. I'm not going to go deep into that rabbit hole, but I do think that it was a very helpful intervention, that executive order. For one, it threatened to do the removal of aid, what was already done with the first round of executive orders when PEPFAR was ended, USAID was ended, and so forth. So by the 7th of October, of February, when that executive order came out, we were already dealing with the cuts. So what was threatened was performative, whereas the performance had started already on the 20th of January. So that's the first thing. It was performative. The second thing is, it was very useful, if I can put it that way, because everyone that knows South Africa knows that if anything, the pace of land reform is far too slow for our population. And therefore, any idea that land was being confiscated, that all of those kind of things were happening, was just palpably false. So I think that it raised South Africa's stature because it reminded people of our very unpleasant history. Because if you were just going to deal with South Africa as just another country, that allegation of Afrikaners being the victims, the oppressed, and therefore worthy of refugee status simply was so false that South Africa's moral stature rose because its moral history was replayed. And my advice was not to try and stop the AfriForum delegations that come here, because the more they are heard, the more they amplify two things. South Africa as the historical victim of white supremacy. And the second, the subtext is, with what supremacy is it being aligned in the USA? You see, because then we begin to see intersecting supremacisms and why the one sees the other as a victim. That's as far down that rabbit hole as I will go. However, I do think that our diplomacy is, as you say, in a very difficult space. But I believe that following the Zelensky meeting, you don't easily want to open the diplomatic channels to the White House unless you have your transactional language in place, and B, you have your deal in place. So a premature visit to the White House without being prepared is not going to help you. And thirdly, taking from the previous speakers, unless you have your values-based foundations in place to know what is negotiable and what is not. If you have those three things, then open the doors of diplomacy to the White House. Otherwise, you're onto a hiding to nothing. But more importantly, the whole issue of the Afrikaner status in South Africa has opened up South Africa's historical alliance with the American people. We were at moments when the White House was closed to even Desmond Tutu and Oliver Tambo.
That's right.
When they called Nelson Mandela a terrorist.
That's right. That's right.
We have never sought our comfort from one house. We have sought our comfort from the millions of houses that refuse to eat our fruit, refuse to offload our ships, refused to come and perform in South Africa, and so forth. So what I think in the reimagination of our relationship with the USA, the important lesson in this time is reconnect with the people of the United States, because they too are bereft of answers and strategies to deal with the phenomenon that exists today. That does not mean we don't want to speak. We want to speak. We will have a deal. We will speak transactions, but we will be firm on our values as we go forward. I hope that answers your question.
I'm Philmona with Global Citizen. And so question for the ambassador. First, thank you for everything you said. I think it so reflects the mood and the feel in Washington and a lot of the thinking about what's next. And so you talked about the need for Africa to become more self-sufficient, for the stronger leadership. And so I guess my question, you talked about Europe also and how it was very concrete. As soon as the White House meeting was over with Ukraine, we saw European leaders unite, step up, call a meeting, invite him there, and they made concrete, like not just words, but actual action, right? Even for themselves, they increased their own security budgets within days, within hours. I haven't really seen that from African leaders. I think there was one country, Nigeria, that increased its global health spending by 200 million to help fill that gap, but we haven't seen that otherwise. So I'm just wondering, I think we all know what needs to happen. We've seen the example of Europe unite and start getting stronger and delivering for themselves. I guess, how realistic is that, do you think, for African leaders at this time? Are we going to see that same kind of united front and not just words, but actual actions? Is the G20 a moment for that? Someone said this could be the time for a united African leadership and agenda. So I guess, I think everyone wants that, but are we really going to see that? Are there countries where you think that's possible? And then as advocates, is there anything that you think people or citizens should be doing to help urge leaders to step up and do what the moment requires?
Thank you. Yes, you're clear. Yes, you can go ahead, Ambassador.
Thanks very much for that. I think that Europe and Africa can become self-sufficient on very, very different bases. The one was the beneficiary of colonialism, the other one was the victim of colonialism. So increasing budgets in Africa is not going to be as nifty as increasing the budget in Europe. In fact, just an aside, another rabbit hole I'm quickly going through. If President Trump feared de-dollarization from BRICS and from South Africa, I think the European idea of de-dollarization may be far more as they seek their independence by putting European Euro bonds onto the market and so forth in order to offset what they may want to spend and so forth. That's I just get out of that rabbit hole very quickly. But I do think that the wherewithal for doing that is different. I know that Germany will raise its debt ceiling. I think that others will print more money. Others will consider the idea of Euro bonds, etc., etc. So they have options like that available to them. I don't think those options are necessarily so in Africa. And so Africa may operate with a timeline that I outlined. I think South Africa may come into the radar on the 2nd of April when the new tariffs are, but certainly I think Africa is operating on a timeline that takes us to September with the AGOA reauthorization. However, we may all be surprised, and there may be ways in which there may be a fairly flat rate tariff placed on all African countries for non-AGOA goods until the authorization of AGOA. So we're going to have to brace ourselves for that. Our options are few, but not absent. And I think that we are going to do what my fellow panelists say. We're going to have to do a lot more trade with each other. That's the first foundation of diversifying our market. I think the unintended consequence that I spoke about in the beginning of my speech, we are going to look to sell more to China. And I've said what the pros and cons are of that approach. I think Europe being a fellow victim, if I can put it like that, Europe being a fellow victim may open its markets far more to Africa, and that's going to have to be explored. So we're going to look for many other baskets within which to put some African eggs. And the G20 may be the moment of coherence for that, because the last unintended consequence of the changing landscape is that America first may become America alone.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. And I like that. So, you said something, I'm going back to the other fellow panelists, which all three of you seem to agree on, this idea of, you talked about moving from solidarity to transactionality. And, I've seen, even much more recently, I know in one of our advocacy efforts we were doing with the Democratic Republic of Congo, where we wanted the US government, congressmen to be more involved to kind of help stave the conflict. We focused on the resources there and what America stands to benefit, which is really shifting. Generally, in this kind of conversation, talking about faith, we should be focused on humanitarian issues, right? But we're talking about mineral resources and what US can benefit from as a pitch so that we can get this the kind of outcome we want. Now, what I wanted to ask, and probably Reverend Angelique, you could start with that, is the US now is also very transactional in this relationship. And I think even before this Trump administration, the focus of the US in Africa has always been around how they can stave off countries like Russia and China. So it hasn't been very, it has been obviously, it has been incremental, but now, so how do we position ourselves, even broadly, not just Africa, but also from a Pan-African perspective? Like, do we want to also just focus on what we have and come into that market from a transactional perspective and then ignore all the other values that we have? Or how do we really stand as a continent, if you might?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of things. We talk about government, governmental leadership, governmental institutions, and then we also talk about the people. I make a distinction, and I think South Africa is the perfect example of that. During the anti-apartheid struggle, I was honored to be a part of that as a young person. I was young at once. And as a young woman, as part of the anti-apartheid struggle, I was standing over and against my government because I love my country, and I love the world, and I'm Pan-African. So I think the strategy has to be at least doubly tiered, right? There are negotiations with those who we quote, unquote, elect. And I mean to say that intentionally, because we know not even the majority of folks in the United States vote. In fact, we need to do better at that, but that's another moment. And then we have those who are the people of the United States. And people who live seriously between the tension of faith and justice, who care about these Judeo-Christian, I would even say multi-faith values, and take it seriously. Now, many of us do vote, but many of us don't. Some have abandoned that particular role of citizenship in this country. And I argue for more participation, but others have their own theological arguments about that as well. So I think when we have this kind of conversation about what is more transactional, what is more diplomatic, we have to think about the larger picture of the picture that we are a part of. And I would say part of the strategy needs to be to make your appeal not only to governments, but to the people. We've seen the results. We went from constructive engagement to sanction. That was the people's mobilization. And some of us in this room were part of that. So I would just argue that there needs to be a clear understanding. And I would say that's not only the case in the United States, that's the case in most parts of the world. I mean, in World Council of Churches, I remember being very pained in a meeting that was a discretionary meeting of the governance leaders, where we were in the room with church leaders from Ukraine and from Russia. They're both parts of the World Council of Churches. And I remember very clearly one mother, she's a dear colleague of mine from Russia, and she stood up and she said, "My husband is from Ukraine. I'm from Russia. My children are both." And she made the point that this is a people issue. It's not just governments, it's people. So again, I just want to reemphasize the importance of having this, at least a double-tiered strategy of thinking about where do we go from here, and particularly as I think of us being as people of faith.
Thank you so much, Reverend Angelique. I think we can get one question online. If somebody online got this one.
So one of the questions is how to overcome ethnic conflict within countries which stand in the way of development and security, like South Sudan or the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
So this is about conflict and which stands in the way. And I just wanted to add to that. So whoever wants to pick that up, I get frustrated a little bit, Ambassador, and I think like some of the solutions we've had today, I mean, we've had them so many times in these rooms, right? And one of the things I wanted to know is we don't speak as one. And Father Sanya, you made that very well. It's called US-Africa relations. Has never really been about US-Africa. It's about US picking their own people, right? So when you had the US, the African leaders who came here upon invitation of President Biden, he engaged them individually. I remember some of those meetings, who goes to Kenya and all that stuff. They organized bilateral agreements. They really try, there's this divide. So there's a lack of regionalism. Now, how are we ever going to achieve that? Like, I just don't see there is the continental African position, but there is a lack of, because obviously these countries are all not, within the same geopolitical. So my question is, Father Sane, there's nothing really new about us working together as a continent, but what is so different? How do we do it? That's different from what we haven't done before, apart from just being transactional.
Thank you. I think it's very honest to say, this is a challenge, what's happening right now. Without challenges, we cannot grow. And allow me to say, even seeing the US coming out with this kind of policy should remind us that we should be grateful for what's happened yesterday, and at the same time be able to question our capacity of receiving so much aid without questioning who we are as human beings. And of course, in this waking up call, the necessity for us to fix our problems should help us understand that the constant invitation of our mindset outside our boundaries is an insult of our internal wisdom. Of course, I like the capacity of being able to do businesses, commerces, and trade within our own countries with very transformed product. But for us to be able to do it, it's more than important to be able to have a capacity of educating our young people to be part of the solutions we want for ourselves in the future. And of course, I trust the capacity of our businessmen and women in Africa to understand that what we have been doing so far is not enough with the new challenge. It's a real call to reimagine and come out with what we have in terms of strength. And I think wisdom is there. What is failing is trust and confidence in ourselves. Because when you see a continent where people have been able to raise such great traditions before colonization, and right now you see all our programs so oriented towards help and aid, for me, it's a shame. So for me, the answer to this question, including conflict resolution and all of these trade questions, is a kind of self-examination, a kind of a big capacity to discern our own place in this planet. And I like what both of you said in terms of speaking to people, because people are those who are making institutions really strong. Governments, policies, human beings, they move. But people, communities, if we have enough strategies to speak to the humanity of people in the US over here, I am very sure we will find the best ways to do trade with them that will benefit the continent. So it's a kind of a dynamic openness, but also a capacity to lead this openness from our own authenticity. That will help us frame what we need in a very respectful way.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, Fatma.
Let her introduce herself first.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Fatma Saberi. What do I say? I do a lot. So I'm an attorney. I policy wonk and community activist, advocate, a whole bunch of different hats. So born in Sierra Leone, but I've lived here my entire life, almost since the age of 11. So, you know, my African side says I'm American. The American side says I'm African. So for those of us who grew up here, we know, right? We're sort of cradling two parts, right? We're like, hey. Yeah. So anyway, so I sort of have a question based on a thought process, which is, I think sometimes when we ask these questions that we're asking and we're talking about these issues that we are, and the ambassador, I really appreciated talking about the white supremacy that that led to, I know you were talking about South Africa, but it's the entire continent, right? And it's just Black people in general, as a people, regardless of where we have found ourselves to be. And as we talk about how the continent should be, and we compare it to Europe and Asia and so on and so forth, I'm always loath to do comparisons, right? Because of who we are and what we have endured. And the fact that a continent is the cradle of the entire world, right? Without the continent, if it blows up today, the entire world collapses. And that's just reality. But I think white supremacy, the colonization, the enslavement of Africans around the world has led to us not realizing what we have. And to a certain degree, not admitting that we are still impacted by white supremacy, that we're still impacted by colonialism, because we want to be strong always. So I'm wondering, as we deal with leaders, because you do, like Ms. Ambassador, with other world leaders or other African leaders, how do we get the leadership to, at some point, admit to what it is that is the driving force? Because you have to first know what you're fighting in order for you to put a strategy in place to fight it. And if we cannot admit that we are where we are due to white supremacy and colonialism and enslavement of people and the removal of the people who could build us, how do we then rise up and fight it? And how do we bring those leaders together in our communities to have that conversation and start moving towards that? Because we can have all these sessions and talk about all these solutions, and you can try to put something in place. But like everything else we do, in order for you to succeed, the strategy needs to be addressed towards a thing, right? Because we're planning, but what are we planning for? And sometimes I feel like when we have this conversation, it feels good to talk about it. And it feels good to say, yes, we need to address that. But if we don't even admit it, like what's it, AA, I think, the first step to a cure is admitting there's a problem, but we are not admitting the current problem we have on the continent and in the diaspora. Because look at where we are. We can't even admit why this man is in office. We are going everywhere, but the real fact, we're not talking about what it is. We're talking about the price of eggs that had absolutely nothing to do with why he was elected. So how do we do it?
Oh, that's a loaded question.
Yeah.
Probably being on the front of
You know,
politics.
when you face a loaded question like that, you turn to the church. You know,
We have a pastor.
believers all want rapture. We all pray for rapture. We want rapture. We yearn and we really desire rapture. But the precondition for rapture is rapture. This is the moment of rapture. And it's in that moment of rapture, when the world is upside down, when things are not what they seem, when normality has shifted, when suddenly you're thrown up a creek without a paddle, and you have to survive. And all you have is your faith and yourself. That's the moment of truth. That's the moment of admission. You know, I call it a Lazarus moment. When you see your death, you can live your life. And this is that moment, not just for Africa, but especially for Africa, because it is more dependent than many others. But it's also a moment of rapture for the world, and it is also a moment of rapture for the USA and its people. They are, and the first barrier to rapture is denial. The Democrats are not finding a coherent idea of why they lost, because they are not looking in, they're looking out. Africa, similarly, will not know what hit them and how to survive this as long as they're looking out and they're not looking in. So I think your point is absolute. How do we use this moment of rupture to get Africa and its leaders to say, we need trade with the US, but the warning is such that if we don't diversify, if we don't push ourselves up the value chain of production, if we don't trade with each other, then no one will look after us except those, as the Reverend said earlier, except those who want to use our vulnerability.
Exactly.
And so I think that that really is the pivotal question, because the knowledge of what has gone wrong is the precondition for knowing how to put it right. And the moment of admitting that we've been sitting on our laurels through AGOA, not pushing up the value chain, not expanding the products. I mean, South Africa, out of probably 5,000 AGOA eligible products, South Africa's got about 2,500, but many Africans have in the hundreds. So we've not begun to really get our act together. But for us to reach the rapture, we must be honest in this moment of rupture. I'm speaking philosophically because I don't have enough details to answer your question, but I'm hoping it's a paradigm for thinking our way out of trouble. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. And I think that's a better way of really answering that question. Yeah, but I wanted to just wrap up.
I have a question.
Okay. Okay, now we'll go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. It has been very interesting to watch the Europeans state that they want to be free from America. But I wonder if they can also see what they have been putting Africa through for so long. Now they can test how bitter is this pill of being dominated. So when Reverend Sane said, the example of the Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, who decided that French domination has been far too long, we are out. But they say, oh, these are cool leaders. The ideas are worth nothing. Is Africa ready to take the bold steps that for good, we say no more exploitation, it's about collaboration, and hopefully maybe keep doing the elections as we have copied from abroad, depending on which governments we want, but the leadership of the ideas of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. I am back.
Thank you so much, Bahati. So I assume that will be a comment, right? Okay. So the way I want, and you have been very gracious with your time. So what I wanted to do is just a final question, which is a way of wrapping up your statements, Mr. Ambassador, and you've been very, very generous with your time. And I wanted to, maybe to Bahati's point about, you talked about equal opportunity. This is administration that equal opportunity is hitting everywhere. It's a Lazarus moment. It's not just Africa, it's everybody that's going through. And maybe it's a time for reset and realignment. As you wrap up, I wanted to ask just final question, and I go through all the others. It's like, we are confused here. I was speaking to my board chair, and one thing is that everybody's angry, but angry, like you said, anger doesn't cook the food, it's hot. We have to do more. What do we have to do constructively? So we, like for organizations based here in Washington, D.C., there are quite a lot, faith-based, non-faith-based. How do we, how do we strategically engage in a way that we get angry because we have to be, but also we don't, like you said, we don't send the middle finger. In other words, you can say, no, don't throw the baby with the bath towel. What kind of advocacy, if you would, suggest? And secondly, all of the aid, if we were going to continue asking for aid, what aid is good based on what we have said? And maybe as a way of wrapping up your very beautiful statements that you made.
No, look, I think that the greatest enemy of human beings is complacency. when you stop thinking, you stop acting, you stop mobilizing, you stop organizing. This moment of rupture has disturbed the complacency. I think those who put down their marching boots when voting rights came in, those who put down their marching boots when Nelson Mandela became president, those who put down their marching boots when the Vietnam War ended, I think there is a way to be good again, and you have been called. Those churches that lost their flock because of complacency, you have the opportunity. Because friendlier governments are more seductive than hostile governments. And when the government is friendly to you, you become complacent. And you shift subtly into what we in South Africa call state theology. And here is this rupture that says, are you ready again for prophetic theology? Because you can see the impact of a hostile anti-human theology. That's all playing out here. There's never been a moment that we have been called to greatness like now. A Palestinian leader once told me, when everyone said, how do the Palestinians manage? He said, the Palestinians don't pray for lighter loads. They pray for stronger shoulders. Don't cry for a new government. Work for. This is the moment that your shoulders must be able to carry that burden. And that's why we're here. That's why I gave up my really comfortable life in South Africa to come and face this challenge. I don't know how long we'll be tolerated here, but the fact of the matter is, it's a blessing that we are called out of our complacency.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you so much. And, you know, we are so happy to have you here as a champion for some of the work we are doing in Africa. Reverend Angelique, I think as a way of summary, and, you know, I wanted to just make one point. You know, Trump is very popular in Africa, by the way, among certain groups, right? Religion seems to be extremely part of that relationship, where people assume, at least, I mean, that's how they assume that he represents Christianity, and somehow Christianity was on that challenge. So somehow this is a champion for that. And I hear that all the time, social media. From your faith, but also, you know, someone who has a very deep faith. I mean, what does this mean for us as advocates, but also for the continent? Because clearly, even though his policies are destroying the continent, but also there's this kind of honest thinking that somehow he represents Christianity, which, you know, hasn't been very clear. And what would be your recommendation? How do you think we can engage in that space? In terms of, do you think that could possibly be a challenge, or do you think Africans generally would be this, you know, kind of divided along faith, religion, in terms of how they engage in the administration?
So I go back to my earlier remarks around the distinctions of the people and the government. So within the people populations, you have alignment with governmental interests. You have alignment with some of the philosophical and theological dispositions of those also in government. In this case, in terms of where we are now, just like we had with also with Mr. Obama, you have faith leaders who are more aligned with the policies of Mr. Obama or Mr. Trump in this case, from the people side. There are bilateral relationships outside of government and also within government. And those bilateral relationships can also be, a challenge, or they can be an opportunity. So today, you will find churches, just to speak to churches, and this, I'm not speaking multi-faith, now I'm thinking churches, who are very much aligned with the election of the president for today, who are also aligned with their mission and ecumenical and evangelical relationships on the continent. So you have a kind of coherence of disposition on theology and government engagement that goes across the Atlantic, goes global, because churches are global. You can't think about what's happening in South Africa, but without also thinking about what's happening in Texas, for example, because those churches are organically related. There are churches organically related. And so as you think about these alignments that are global, not just say in Texas or New Mexico and South Africa, but also the Pacific, etc. You think of the world as one world of where the voices are resonating together around theological alignments and therefore political engagement. So that's why I'm saying there has to be this kind of, I said double tier, but really it's a multi-tiered strategy of how it is you look at these people alignments and government alignments. And then you create your strategy from within that. Because if you're not able to map it very well, then you're going to come out with results you may not like. I buy into what is, at least what I was taught in seminary, this kind of remnant theology. A remnant theology that says, regardless of where you are in the world, there are going to be those who align more so with, if you will, faith and justice. And then you're going to, that's what I call the remnant. Well, that's what my professor, prophet said. The remnant that stands in that deep gap between faith and justice. And then you have others who have other priorities around their faith. And it's important to try to figure out where those communities are, because it can have everything to do with your strategy and if it's successful or not. So hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you so much, Reverend. Thank you. That's a very good way of saying it. So, Father, so maybe I would just may as a way of the whole idea of realignment. If you have maybe in a minute or so, how would you kind of what message would you want to basically suggest? I mean, like specific type of realignment that's hasn't worked before, but absolutely take into consideration the fact that some countries are going to engage the US regardless of that. So there is going to be a lack of consensual speaking. So how do specific countries, how do we really work within that? And the final point was somebody asked a question about the wars in Congo and all that. Maybe as a way of wrapping up without forgetting that, what's the best strategy here, like for some of us to still continue to engage the US government from this perspective? Maybe just briefly.
I would say the best strategies are to be built. We cannot just open the bag and say these are the best strategies. And I think it's a kind of ongoing research in terms of finding and trying models. And I from now I cannot tell you these are specific strategies. I think the work you are doing, AFJN, is something to be increased in this country in terms of conversation with people over here and have them understand more about Africa. There is a specific image of Africa that I used to see in the US images that sometimes make me very nervous. It is seeing the continent as a place to go for help, go and aid people, go to do charity, because there are many, many beggars in this continent, many, many poor people, many, many people to help. Please, if AFJN succeed in increasing the positivity of the continent as a place for great opportunities, we will have people who will be willing to go there, not necessarily to help, but to do business, to trade. So my main expectation from you, AFJN, is to emphasize this fact. I think conflicts and wars in Africa are created, maintained, and fed because they just help maintain the chaos that is very necessary for mineral exploitations. And I think to end that, we have to deal with those who are benefiting from this chaos and have them understand that the prosperity of these countries, like the Congo, will never undermine the prosperity of the US. Because sometimes people think if there is a specific order there, we shall no longer be able to exploit. But I think the opposite. So for me, your role should continually be a kind of framing these kind of paradigms, having people understand more that we all benefit better when there is order, when there is a discipline, and when we have enough capacities of understanding that there is enough for everybody. If there is more respect in terms of relationships. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Father. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please give all of our speakers. I want to thank His Excellency for coming here.
Thank you.
I want to thank Reverend Angelique, and I want to thank Father Sane and to our online audience. Thank you so much for staying around with us. I know we went a little bit, but as you could see, this was such a very helpful conversation.